My name is Hannah Walker. I am 24 years old, and the day I graduated college was supposed to be the first day I finally felt worthy in my own family. Instead, it became the day my life cracked open. I was standing in my parents' backyard in Caldwell, Idaho, surrounded by string lights my mother hung to make everything look cheerful and perfect, the kind of backyard scene neighbors would think was wholesome and loving. Except it was not. I had just finished college after years of pulling doubles at a diner, studying in break rooms, selling my old guitar for books, and sleeping only 4 or 5 hours a night. I thought maybe, just maybe, this gathering would be the moment my parents would look at me with some amount of real pride. But from the second I stepped into the yard, I could feel the truth pressing in like heavy air before a storm. No one asked about my major. No one hugged me. No one said they were proud. Instead, everyone circled around my older brother Ethan the way they always had, like planets revolving around a sun that burned too hot and never gave anything back. Ethan was 31, loud, broad-shouldered, and magnetic in a way that pulled people in even when he had nothing of value to offer. My parents adored him, boasted about him, excused every cruel thing he did. He was the golden child, the one who had potential, even though he had bounced between jobs, racked up debts, and gotten into fights more times than I could count. I, on the other hand, had never given them trouble, never asked for anything, never missed a shift or a bill or a deadline. But in our house, responsibility was invisible. Chaos was worshipped, and Ethan was chaos wrapped in a grin. I remember standing beside the folding table where my graduation cake sat. It was a simple rectangular cake with the words, "Congratulations, Hannah," in pale blue letters. I had imagined taking a picture with it, maybe posting it online showing the world that I had made it through. But someone had shoved it to the very edge of the table, right next to a bucket of half-melted ice and warm canned soda. People brushed past it without noticing. The corner was already smudged where someone had bumped it. My stomach knotted, not because of the cake itself, but because deep down I recognized the symbolism. That cake was me, barely clinging to the corner, overlooked, unimportant. Ethan appeared behind me with a beer in his hand and a smirk in his voice. "Took you 6 years to finish college. Congrats, I guess." His friends snickered. My parents did not correct him. They never corrected him. I forced a smile and tried to breathe through the tightness in my chest. It was my day, after all. I wanted so badly for it to be peaceful. But Ethan thrived on finding cracks and digging his thumbs in. He stepped closer, towering over me. "You act like this is some big deal." "It is just school. Some of us have real jobs." I felt my cheeks heat not from shame, but from the familiar sting of being spoken to like I was small. I turned away, hoping he would lose interest, but that only made him bolder. Without warning, he slammed his palm against the table. The cake lurched, then slid as if in slow motion before dropping off the edge and hitting the patio with a wet, smashing sound. White frosting splattered across the concrete. A few guests gasped, but no one moved. I stared at the ruined cake, unable to speak. Ethan laughed, the kind of laugh that was meant to humiliate, not amuse. "You look shocked. Do not be so sensitive." When I still did not respond, he reached behind my head and grabbed a handful of my hair. Pain shot across my scalp as he shoved my head downward until my knees hit the ground with a sharp jolt. My face hovered inches above the smashed frosting and dirt. "Eat it," he said loudly. "Isn't this what you wanted?" His voice carried across the yard. People heard. People watched. People did nothing. My mother Diane laughed harder than anyone. "Hannah, stop being dramatic. He is just messing around." My father, Rick, sighed like I was ruining his evening. "You always make everything about you." The humiliation burned through me like fire. My hair was tangled in Ethan's hand, my palms scraped against the concrete, and my college dress was smeared with frosting. But the worst part was the laughter. Not Ethan's cruelty, but my parents' amusement. Their total lack of concern. Their willingness to let their son shove their daughter onto the ground on her graduation day. Something inside me broke then. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, the way a thin piece of glass breaks under pressure you did not know was there. I pushed myself away from Ethan, slipping on the frosting as I scrambled to my feet. My legs shook, my throat burned. I could not even look at my parents. I walked past the guests, past the tables, past the string lights that suddenly felt suffocating. I walked out of the gate and onto the street without taking anything with me. Not my bag, not my phone, not my dignity because that had already been ripped away. Behind me, I heard Ethan laugh again. I heard my mother say, "She gets like this. Just give her a minute." But I did not slow down. I kept walking. And as the noise of the party faded behind me, I realized something cold and sharp and undeniable. I was not their daughter. I was their target. That night, long after I had walked away from the backyard and driven back to the small apartment I rented in Seattle, my phone lit up with the kind of message that changes something in you forever. Not because of the words themselves, but because of how unsurprising they feel after a lifetime of being treated like an inconvenience. I had taken a long shower, trying to wash off the frosting dust and humiliation that still clung to my skin, then curled up on my couch with a blanket staring at the ceiling and replaying everything that had happened, wondering how a family could laugh at their own daughter being pushed to the ground like a joke. Around 11:30, my phone buzzed again and again, but I let it ring until it went silent, unwilling to hear Ethan or my parents explain why what happened to me was somehow my fault. When I finally picked it up hours later after my breathing had steadied and the apartment felt still enough to let me think clearly, I saw a single text from my mother written with the coldness of someone sending a business memo rather than speaking to her own child. "We need space from your attitude. Do not come back until you learn respect." I stared at the sentence, feeling no shock, no sting, only a slow hollowing that settled behind my ribs like an echo of something I should have seen coming years ago. Ethan had reacted with a thumbs up as if he were encouraging my punishment, as if shoving my head toward a smashed cake was justified because my existence inconvenienced him. I read their words again and again, letting each one sink in, not as a rejection, but as confirmation of what I had felt my whole life. That love in my family was conditional, transactional, and always tilted in favor of the child who demanded the most while giving the least. A part of me wondered whether my mother had typed that message while still holding her wine glass, still laughing about what Ethan did, still choosing to interpret my pain as oversensitivity rather than cruelty. I imagined her sitting at the patio table while guests finished their drinks, complaining about how I had embarrassed her, how I could not handle a simple joke, how I always made everything so hard and the thought should have hurt, but instead it felt numb, like hitting a bruise that had been there for years. My father did not text, which somehow felt worse, because silence from him had always meant agreement. Quiet endorsement of whatever Ethan did, the same way he stayed silent every time Ethan broke something of mine as a kid or mocked me during dinner or shoved me out of the way while walking through the hallway. I knew this was not just a message telling me to stay away for a few days. It was a statement of who they believed I was: ungrateful, dramatic, inconvenient, someone who should apologize for being hurt, someone who should shrink to make room for their preferred child. I sat there on my sofa with the glow of the screen lighting the dark room, and I waited for the ache to come, for the tears to fall, for the crushing sadness I expected to feel, but none of it arrived. Instead, I felt a strange quiet spreading through me. Not peace, not strength, but clarity. The realization that I could disappear from their lives, and they would not chase after me, not because they did not love me, but because they never saw me clearly enough to miss me. I reread the text one more time and felt my throat tighten, not with sadness, but with exhaustion. Years of bending, accommodating, giving, and being told that whatever I offered was never enough. I placed the phone face down on the coffee table, leaned back into the couch, and let the stillness of my apartment wrap around me like a truth I had been afraid to face. That night, for the first time in my life, I understood that sometimes the most devastating words are not shouted in anger, but typed without hesitation, delivered without thought, and sent by the people who should have protected you. I understood that this message was not a rupture in the relationship, but the unveiling of it. And sitting there in the dim glow of the apartment with the sound of distant traffic humming through the open window, I whispered to myself the quiet truth I had been avoiding for years: they never wanted me to come home. I drove through the night with the kind of focus that does not feel like control, but like surrender, the highway stretching endlessly ahead of me as if it were the only escape route carved out in the universe. and I clung to it because I did not know what else to do. The air smelled like rain and asphalt, the Idaho sky dark and wide above me, and every few miles the headlights of a passing car reminded me that the world was bigger than that backyard, bigger than the laughter behind me, bigger than the small box my family had always tried to keep me in. And for the first time, I let myself drift through the silence without trying to push away the thoughts that kept rising like bruises beneath the skin. I played no music because everything inside me felt too loud already. Each memory replaying itself in flashes, the smashed cake, Ethan's fingers gripping my hair, my mother's bright laughter slicing into me sharper than any physical pain, the way my father's eyes filled with irritation instead of concern, and the moment I realized I could walk away and no one would stop me, not because they trusted me, but because they simply did not care enough to follow. By the time the Welcome to Washington sign appeared, the sky had shifted to a deep gray, and the first hints of morning began to show behind the mountains, though it felt impossible that only a few hours had passed since the chaos of the party. My hands were stiff from gripping the steering wheel for so long, and the muscles in my jaw ached from clenching, but I kept going, crossing the floating bridge into Seattle, as raindrops hit the windshield like someone tapping insistently at a locked window, reminding me that I was back in the only place where I had ever been allowed to breathe. When I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment building in Queen Anne, my body felt as if it had been drained of everything except a dull, throbbing heaviness, the kind that settles behind your ribs when you finally stop running. I sat in the car for a long moment, staring at the familiar brick facade, the narrow iron staircase leading up to the walkway, and the soft glow of porch lights someone had forgotten to turn off. And I felt something close to gratitude, that at least this place, small and imperfect as it was, belonged to me in a way my childhood home never had. I climbed the stairs slowly, the cold air brushing the damp ends of my hair, my hands shaking just enough that I had to steady myself before unlocking the door. Inside, the apartment smelled faintly of lavender detergent and the last meal I had cooked earlier in the week, a comforting quiet greeting me as I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. The silence felt heavy, but also strangely gentle, like a blanket pulled over someone still shivering from a bad dream. I dropped my keys on the small table near the door, slipped off my shoes, and let myself sink onto the couch without turning on the lights, the faint glow from the street lamps outside casting long shadows across the room, and for a moment the silence felt like a relief so profound that I could not move, could not think, could only sit there and breathe. Eventually, the adrenaline began to fade, leaving me exhausted and shaky, and I leaned forward, grabbing my laptop from the coffee table, opening it out of habit more than intention. The screen flickered to life, illuminating the apartment with a cold blue light, and without knowing exactly why I opened my bank account, maybe looking for something familiar, or maybe seeking reassurance that some part of my life was still stable, still functional, still mine. But the moment the transactions loaded, my stomach dropped, a cold wave rising through my chest as line after line after line appeared before me, each one a reminder of something I had tried not to think about for months. The money withdrawn automatically for my parents' mortgage, the payment for Ethan's truck loan, both charges hitting my account every month like clockwork, even though I could barely afford rent and groceries. I stared at the numbers, feeling a kind of disbelief that was not actually disbelief at all, but the slow dawning of something I had always known deep down, that my family had built their financial safety on my back because they knew I would never refuse them, because I had been raised to believe that my value came from helping, supporting, absorbing, and never asking for anything in return. I clicked through old emails, the ones from my mother reminding me to make sure the payment went through, the ones saying, "We just need a little help until next month," the ones assuring me they would take over the mortgage payments as soon as Dad's job stabilized. And each message felt like another stone being added to a weight I had carried so long that I had forgotten it was not supposed to feel that heavy. I remembered signing the mortgage papers 2 years earlier, my mother saying, "You are the responsible one. Honey, you will help keep us afloat," and at the time I believed her. Believed it meant I was valued, needed, important, but now looking at the deductions bleeding my bank account dry, I realized it had never been love-only convenience. I closed my eyes and exhaled, trying to steady my breathing, as the reality settled over me like a thick fog. And then, with a trembling hand, I opened my budget spreadsheet, scrolling through the color-coded lines I had created during college, just to survive the endless adjustments, the notes reminding myself to skip coffee for the week to walk instead of take the bus to delay buying textbooks until the last possible moment. None of it mattered. Because no matter how tightly I stretched my own finances, the money kept disappearing into two debts that were not mine. Sitting there on my couch with the glow of the laptop shining on my tired face, I felt the shape of something shift inside me, something sharp and unmistakable. Not anger exactly, but a strange, rising clarity, the kind that comes when you finally see a truth that has been living behind your shoulder for years. It whispered the thing I had been afraid to admit, the thing that had been chasing me from Idaho to Seattle all night long. The thing that made my heart race and my hands shake as I stared at the screen. They did not just humiliate me today, they have been using me for years. And sitting alone in my quiet apartment with rain tapping steadily against the window, I whispered to myself the words that finally felt undeniable, words that settled into my chest with the weight of a decision that would change everything. I cannot keep living like this. I do not know what pushed me to drag the old cardboard box out from the back of my closet that night, but something inside me kept whispering that there were answers buried somewhere in the stacks of papers I had avoided sorting through for years. So I pulled the box into the middle of my living room floor, brushed off the thin layer of dust that had collected on top, and opened it with the same uneasy feeling you get when you sense a truth is waiting for you on the other side of a door. The box held years of my life in chaotic layers. Old report cards, birthday cards from my grandmother June, written in her looping handwriting, a few childhood drawings, the acceptance letter from my college that I once cried over because I never thought I would be able to afford tuition, and at the very bottom, beneath a folder of tax documents and pay stubs from my high school job bagging groceries, I found a thin blue envelope with my grandmother's handwriting on it, the ink faded around the corners, the paper slightly wrinkled but intact, and when I picked it up, my heart thudded against my ribs as if it already knew the shape of what I was about to discover. I slid my finger under the flap and opened it carefully, almost reverently, unfolding the letter inside and smoothing it on my knee. The words swimming in the dim lamplight, and as I read, a feeling I cannot fully describe washed through me, something between disbelief, grief, and an old wound reopening. The letter was dated 14 years earlier, written the summer I turned 10, and it began with my grandmother saying how proud she was of me, how she knew I was meant for big things, how she had set up a college fund in my name, so that when the day came, I would be able to go to school without worrying the way my mother had worried in her youth. She wrote that she wanted me to have opportunities, that she believed in me, that she had put aside money for me each year since I was born, investing it carefully so that by the time I turned 18, I could choose any college I wanted. Her words felt like a warm embrace reaching across time, but as I reached the last lines, the warmth dissolved into a cold that seeped into my bones. Because she wrote that everything about the fund, including the statements and account details, had been placed in a separate folder and given directly to my parents for safekeeping, that she trusted them to keep it safe for me. I read the letter again slower this time, tracing each word with my eyes, trying to process what it meant, and a sickening suspicion began coiling in my stomach, one that felt so awful, I almost tried to shove the letter back into the envelope and pretend I had never seen it. Instead, I kept digging through the cardboard box until I found the folder. She mentioned a yellow one with my name written across the front in the same neat cursive, and when I opened it, a wave of nausea rolled through me because inside were statements showing deposits my grandmother had made over the years, notes in her handwriting discussing interest growth and projected totals, and then abruptly the updates stopped. The year I turned 15. There were no statements after that, no new deposits, nothing to explain what had happened, and the absence was louder than any explanation could have been. I sat frozen on the floor, the folder open across my lap, staring at the empty space where the later documents should have been, and a horrifying clarity began rising the way a tide rises before a storm hits the shore, unstoppable and merciless. I grabbed my laptop again, fingers trembling, and searched my emails for anything related to financial aid. And as I scrolled, I found an email from the college financial office from my freshman year one. I had read years earlier without thinking too deeply, stating that my FAFSA had been flagged for verification because my parents reported insufficient funds and no savings intended for my education. I remembered asking my mother about it at the time and her saying, "Money has been tight for years. Honey, your grandmother did not leave anything for school. She helped enough while she was alive." And I had believed her because she said it with such certainty, such practiced ease, and because I was 18 and still thought my parents were incapable of lying about something so important. But sitting on the floor now with the letters and statements scattered around me, the truth became blindingly clear. A truth so sharp I could feel it cut something inside me as it settled into place. They took it all of it, whatever my grandmother had saved for me, whatever she had scraped together from her pension and part-time sewing jobs, whatever she had hoped would open doors for me, and they used it for Ethan. I knew it even before I found the confirmation, but I kept searching because some part of me still clung to the hope that I was wrong, that misunderstanding was safer than betrayal. But as I dug through an old plastic file of scanned documents, I found a printed email chain between my parents from years earlier. One I must have accidentally grabbed while moving and never bothered reading, and right there, spelled out with brutal indifference, was the answer. The emails mentioned a personal loan Ethan had taken when he was 25, the one he had defaulted on, the one collectors had hounded them about for months, and my mother had written to my father. "Maybe we should clear this with the account from June. Hannah does not need it right now." And my father had replied, "She can get scholarships or work." Ethan needs stability first, and in a final message my mother wrote, "Then let us do it now before it grows too much. She will understand when she is older." I felt the air leave my lungs in a slow, hollow exhale as the reality settled over me, heavier than humiliation, heavier than debt, heavier than anything that had happened at the party. Because this was not a moment of cruelty or anger. It was a calculated choice, a long-term decision to strip me of something that had been mine, something that had been meant to protect me. I pressed my fingers to my temples, trying to steady myself as the room seemed to tilt faintly and the memories flooded in all at once. Every night I had gone to bed exhausted from working 2 jobs while trying to study. Every semester I had cried while checking my tuition bill. Every shift I had pulled in, freezing weather, every time I had wondered why my parents had not been able to help at all. And behind each memory I saw the same truth echoing silently. They could have helped. They simply chose not to. I closed my eyes tightly, holding back the sting building behind them, and as the anger and grief and disbelief swirled inside me, another emotion began rising beneath it. Something quieter but sharper, a feeling that came from a place deeper than fear or sadness, a feeling that whispered a truth I could no longer ignore. They never planned for me to succeed. They planned for me to endure. The weight of it settled into my chest with a finality that made it hard to breathe, and in the stillness of my apartment, surrounded by proof of what had been taken from me, I let the truth form into a thought so clear it felt like it could shatter the room. If I do not protect myself now, no one ever will. I do not know what made me check my credit report that night, whether it was instinct fear or the lingering shock of realizing my college fund had been drained without a second thought. But something inside me kept nudging a quiet warning that if one betrayal had been hidden for years, there was a good chance others were sitting in the dark, waiting to be found. So I opened my laptop again, my hands still trembling slightly, and navigated to the credit monitoring site. I had not checked in months because I assumed I had nothing to worry about, and as the page loaded, the spinning icon on the screen felt like the slow turn of a lock clicking open on a door I never meant to open. When the report finally appeared, a dense list of numbers and accounts and dates, my eyes scanned through it quickly at first, then more slowly, each line twisting something inside my stomach because there halfway down the page, under a section labeled Revolving Accounts, was a store credit card I had never opened in my life, issued 3 years earlier, around the time I was still scraping by on minimum wage and stretching every paycheck across textbooks and rent. The account had an outstanding balance of $3,200 with multiple missed payments over the last year. Late fees piled on top of the original charges, and the most chilling part was the address listed on the account. Not my apartment in Seattle, Not the dorm room I once lived in, but my parents' house in Caldwell, Idaho, the place I had left behind the moment I turned 18. A strange, cold tightness pulled across my chest as I leaned closer to the screen, rereading the line again and again, hoping I had misinterpreted something, anything, but the details did not shift. The account number did not disappear, and the truth only grew more solid the longer I stared at it. I clicked on the account details, my pulse quickening as the page opened to show the history of purchases, and every line felt like another blow. Electronics, power tools, sports equipment, none of it anything I had ever bought or needed or could afford, but all of it exactly the kind of things Ethan liked to accumulate and then abandon when he got bored or when collectors started calling. I tried to steady my breathing, trying to absorb the magnitude of what I was seeing, because opening a credit card under someone else's social security number was not just irresponsible or inconsiderate. It was illegal fraud, the kind of thing that could destroy someone's credit for years, affect their ability to rent, to get a loan, to build a life. And suddenly, all the financial struggles I had faced in the last few years took on a new, horrifying shape. I remembered trying to get a lower interest rate on my student loan and being denied for reasons that made no sense at the time. I remembered being told that my credit was not strong enough to qualify for a renter's promotional rate, even though I had never missed a payment on anything I actually owned, and I remembered how embarrassed I had felt, how I blamed myself, thinking I had done something wrong, when in reality the damage had been quietly accumulating in the background from an account I did not even know existed. I sat back on the couch, my hand covering my mouth, trying to keep the rising panic contained, and as I stared at the glowing screen, the image of Ethan's smirking face from earlier that day flashed through my mind, the way he had shoved the cake, the way he had grabbed my hair and pushed me to the ground like I was nothing, and a realization crept in slowly but unmistakably. He did not just humiliate me in front of our family. He had been stealing from me for years, using my identity as if it belonged to him, because in his mind and in the minds of our parents, I existed to be used. I clenched my hands into fists, feeling the weight of the discovery settling into my bones, and I clicked through more documents, checking every account on the report in a blur of dread and determination. The more I looked, the clearer the pattern became. Missed payments, late fees, traces of financial chaos that did not match my life at all, and each one pointed back to the same source, the house in Caldwell, the people inside it, the entitlement that had been nurtured there for decades. I remembered a moment 2 years earlier when I was visiting for Thanksgiving, standing in the kitchen while my parents whispered in the hallway, their voices low and urgent, and when I stepped closer, I heard my mother say, "Just let her handle it, she always does," and my father reply, "She is stronger than he is. She can take the hit." And at the time, I thought they were talking about emotional responsibility, the way they always expected me to smooth things over, to forgive Ethan, to keep quiet. But now, with the credit report glowing coldly in front of me, the meaning shifted, taking on a new and chilling clarity. I realized they had not just expected me to absorb his anger, they had expected me to absorb his debt, his mistakes, his recklessness to act as a financial shield the same way I had been forced to act as an emotional one. I closed the laptop slowly, the click of it shutting echoing louder than it should have in the quiet room, and I leaned back against the couch, staring at the ceiling as the truth settled over me with suffocating weight. The betrayal was not passive or accidental, but deliberate. Calculated, woven into the fabric of our family dynamic so deeply that they had never questioned whether it was wrong to use my social security number, never questioned whether I deserved better, never questioned whether I was more than a resource to be tapped whenever Ethan messed up. I felt anger begin to rise, not wild or explosive, but controlled, sharp a blade forged from years of being told to stay quiet, to be grateful, to be patient, to swallow everything and smile. And as the memories of scraping by in college flickered through my mind, all the nights I had stayed up worrying about bills, all the weekends I had worked, instead of resting all the times I had told myself that my struggles were just part of growing up, the anger sharpened into something like resolve. I stood up slowly, feeling my legs steady beneath me, and walked to the window, looking out at the wet Seattle streets glistening under the glow of streetlights. And for the first time in my life, the idea of cutting my family off did not feel cruel. It felt necessary. because in that moment, with the rain tapping softly against the glass and the truth burning bright and deadly behind my ribs, I understood something with absolute certainty, something that could not be softened or ignored. They had not just taken money from me, they had taken years, choices, opportunities, safety, and they had done it without hesitation, without guilt, without even the decency to hide their satisfaction when they benefited from it. And as I stood there, breathing in the cool night air, I whispered to myself the words that finally crystallized the truth of everything I had learned that night. A promise more than a confession, a boundary I had never dared to draw until now I am done letting them own my life. I stood in the center of my dim living room long after I had closed the laptop, the glow from the streetlights casting thin golden lines across the floor, and for the first time in my life, I felt something inside me settle into a kind of stillness that was not numbness but clarity. The kind that comes when denial finally loses its grip and the truth becomes too loud to ignore. I had spent years telling myself that my family loved me in their own way, that their expectations and dismissals were normal, that their neglect was just personality, not cruelty. But now, with proof piled on my coffee table of all the ways they had drained, used, and erased me, the truth pressed against my chest with a weight that made it hard to breathe. I realized that if I stayed silent, if I kept letting things slide the way I always had, nothing would ever change, and I would keep giving until there was nothing left of me to give because people like Ethan and my parents never stopped taking. They only stopped when the person they were using finally stepped out of reach. I walked to the kitchen sink and splashed cold water on my face, gripping the counter as if steadying myself for something I already knew I had to do, and the water dripping down my cheeks felt almost cleansing, like a baptism into a life where I finally chose myself over them. I dried my hands, slowly feeling the roughness of the towel against my skin, and I picked up my phone from the coffee table, staring at the black screen for a long moment before unlocking it. The family group chat sat at the top of my messages, the unread notifications glaring at me like small sparks waiting to ignite another fire, and I opened the chat, scrolling past the earlier messages from that night. Ethan sending laughing emojis after my mother told me not to come back. My father adding nothing as usual, their silence always a form of agreement. I stared at the message box, my fingers hovering above the keyboard while my heartbeat thudded steadily in my ears, and for the first time in years, maybe ever, I felt no fear of their reaction, no guilt, no shame, no desperate hope that someone would finally see my worth the way a child waits for a parent's approval. Instead, a kind of calm resolve washed over me, steady and unshakable, because the worst had already happened, and there was nothing left for them to take that they had not already stolen. So I typed the words slowly, each one solid and deliberate, as if laying down bricks in a wall I should have built a long time ago. Starting tomorrow, I am removing myself from every loan, nothing more, nothing less, just the truth of what I was going to do, free of apology, free of explanation, free of the usual softness I had always been expected to offer. I read the sentence again before pressing send, letting the weight of it settle into the air around me like a stone thrown into still water. And then I hit the button, watching the message appear in the chat like a quiet declaration of independence. There was no immediate response, no explosion of anger, no frantic calls, just silence, a silence that felt both eerie and liberating, as if they had not expected me to say anything at all. As if they believed I would continue being the invisible support, holding up their lives while they never considered mine. I set the phone face down on the table and took a slow breath, the kind that fills your lungs and then leaves your body in a long, steady release. And for the first time in years, I felt a flicker of control return to me, a fragile but undeniable sense that I had drawn a line they could not cross without consequence. The apartment felt incredibly quiet. The hum of the refrigerator, the only sound in the room, and the weight of the moment settled over me in a way that felt more like relief than fear, as if I had been holding my breath for years and had finally exhaled. I walked to the window and looked out at the city, the rain beginning to fall again, tiny streaks sliding down the glass, like the sky itself had begun to soften, and as the lights of passing cars reflected on the wet pavement, I let myself whisper the words I had never dared say out loud. Not until the moment I sent that message, I owe them nothing, and they cannot take anything more from me. It was not anger anymore, not bitterness, but freedom, the first small taste of it, and I stood there for a long moment, letting it sink into me, letting it become real, letting it become a truth I would not back away from in the morning, because I knew that tomorrow would bring chaos, calls, accusations, guilt, every tactic they had ever used to keep me in line. But none of it mattered anymore because by sending that one line, I had taken the first step out of the cage I had spent my entire life pretending was home. And as the rain continued to fall outside, soft but steady, I knew with absolute clarity that there was no going back. I woke the next morning to the muffled sound of rain tapping against my bedroom window, soft but insistent, as if the city itself was trying to pull me out of the fog that clung to me like a second skin. I lay there for a moment staring at the ceiling, letting the events of the previous night drift back into focus, the message I had sent to my family still lingering in my mind like a quiet flame. Small but powerful, and I felt a strange mix of dread and determination settle into my chest. I knew today would have to be the day I stopped letting fear dictate my life. The day I stopped letting my family's choices swallow me whole. The day I did something real to reclaim the parts of myself I had lost along the way. I pulled myself out of bed, made a cup of coffee, and opened my laptop at the kitchen table, feeling the weight of what I was about to do pressing down on me. Not crushing, but anchoring me in a way that felt new. Firm, as if my spine had finally learned how to hold itself upright after years of bending. I searched for the nearest branch of Northwest Federal Bank, the same bank that held the mortgage my parents had tied to my name, and I booked an appointment with a loan specialist at 10:30. My finger, hesitating briefly before pressing confirm, as if part of me still could not believe I was taking the step I had avoided for so long. The minutes leading up to the appointment crawled and buzzed at the same time, a jittery mix of adrenaline and exhaustion, making it impossible to sit still, and by 10:15 I was already in my raincoat keys in hand, heading down the narrow stairwell of my building. The rain had picked up outside, drops falling in steady sheets that blurred the passing cars and turned the sidewalks into slick mirrors of silver and gray. And as I walked to the bus stop, I felt myself moving with a sense of purpose. I had not felt in years, each step firm against the pavement, each breath deep enough to keep the panic from rising. The bank sat on the corner of a quiet street, its glass doors reflecting the muted light of the overcast morning, and when I pushed them open, the crisp, cool air inside hit my cheeks and sent a shiver down my spine, grounding me for a brief moment before a receptionist with warm eyes and a practiced smile asked for my name. I gave it, and she told me to wait in the small seating area near the windows, offering me a cup of coffee. I declined because my hands were already shaking too much to hold anything steady. A few minutes later, a man appeared in the hallway and said my name with a calmness that instantly eased something tight in my chest. Hannah Walker. Come on back, we will get everything sorted out. He introduced himself as Benjamin Clark, a loan specialist in his mid-50s with thinning gray hair, wire-framed glasses, and the kind of patient expression that seemed unaffected by the usual tension that filled financial offices. I followed him into a small room with pale blue walls, a rectangular table, and a potted plant in the corner that looked like it had been kept alive purely through stubbornness rather than proper care. And when he gestured for me to sit, I felt myself exhale as if I had been holding my breath since the moment I opened my credit report 2 nights earlier. He sat across from me and folded his hands neatly on the table, waiting for me to explain why I was there. But when I tried to speak, the words felt sticky and tangled in my throat, and for a moment, all I could do was stare at the stack of printed documents I had brought with me, the weight of years of quiet suffering compressed into a thin folder. After a moment, he said gently, "Take your time. Hannah, whatever this is, we will figure it out together." And something about the steadiness in his voice loosened the knot in my chest enough for me to finally speak. I told him everything, my voice trembling as I described how I had co-signed the mortgage for my parents because they said they needed my help, how I had been paying part of the loan without realizing the full extent of it, how my brother's truck loan had been attached to my account because his credit was too poor to qualify without me, and how I had discovered the fraudulent credit card opened under my name. As I spoke, Benjamin listened without interrupting, his brow tightening slightly at certain details, his eyes softening at others, and when I finished, he let out a slow breath that sounded like a mix of understanding and controlled frustration on my behalf. "Hannah," he said finally, the quiet, measured tone of someone who has delivered hard truths 100 times. "What you are describing is not helping your family. It is exploitation. And the fact that it has gone on this long is deeply concerning." The word exploitation landed like a stone in the pit of my stomach. Not because it was new, but because hearing someone else say it out loud made it real in a way I had avoided confronting. He opened the folder I had placed in front of him, scanning through the pages with practiced efficiency, pausing occasionally to make notes on a legal pad. When he finished reviewing everything, he leaned back in his chair and said, "The good news is that there are steps we can take to remove you from these obligations, but the process will require documentation time and a firm stance on your part." I nodded, sitting straighter, letting his words settle into me like a blueprint for a future I had not realized was possible. He explained the process, starting with the mortgage, how the bank could initiate a cosigner release if I provided proof that I had no financial interest in the property, meaning I did not live there, did not contribute willingly, and had no ownership rights. He handed me a list of documents I would need, including a copy of my lease pay stubs showing my Seattle income and messages or emails that demonstrated the nature of my involvement. And as he spoke, I felt the room shift slightly, as if hope itself had started taking up space beside me. Next, he discussed the truck loan, explaining that although cosigner removals were more complicated for personal vehicle loans, the bank could still begin the review if I filed a formal request supported by financial documents proving that the loan was never meant to be my responsibility. He moved on to the credit card fraud, instructing me to file an identity theft report with the Federal Trade Commission and to freeze my credit immediately to prevent further damage. And he printed out the exact steps I needed to take, highlighting the relevant sections with a yellow marker. By the time he finished outlining the process, the weight in my chest had started to feel less like suffocation and more like a pressure I could finally push back against. And when he said, "I want you to understand that you are not alone in this and that you are doing the right thing," something inside me softened, warmed, and steadied. I had spent years thinking that asking for help was weakness, that needing protection meant I had failed somehow, but sitting in that small office with the hum of printers in the background and the faint smell of coffee drifting in from the hallway, I realized that seeking help was not weakness, it was survival, and it was the first real act of reclaiming my life. Benjamin slid final forms across the table toward me, each one a legal step toward disentangling my identity from the debts that had been wrapped around it like chains. And as I took the pen he offered and signed the first form, my hand trembled, not from fear, but from the unmistakable feeling that with each signature, each stroke of ink across paper, I was cutting through cords that had been binding me to a life I no longer owed anything to. When the last form was signed, Benjamin stamped the documents with a firm, echoing thud that filled the room with a sense of finality, then looked up at me with a steady gaze and said, "You did the right thing today." I nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in my throat, and as I gathered my papers and stood to leave, I felt taller somehow, lighter, as if the ground beneath me had finally started to feel solid. Stepping back out into the rain, I inhaled deeply, letting the cool air fill my lungs as raindrops peppered my coat and hair, and for the first time in years, the world felt wide open and my life for once felt like it could finally be my own. I woke the next morning to the sound of my phone vibrating so violently on the nightstand that for a split second I thought it might fall off and shatter, the buzzing loud enough to slice through the gentle hum of early morning traffic drifting in from the street outside. I blinked against the pale Seattle light filtering through the blinds and reached for the phone, still groggy, still wrapped in the strange, quiet clarity that had carried me through the night before, and when the screen lit up the number of missed calls made my breath catch in my throat. 127 from my mother, my father, Ethan, and 3 numbers from Idaho I did not recognize. I stared at the notifications, watching them multiply as new calls came in the phone, trembling in my hand like a frightened heartbeat, and for a long moment I simply let it ring, the sound filling the room with a frantic energy that felt completely at odds with the calm I had fought to claim the day before. Eventually, curiosity overpowered exhaustion, and I answered one of the calls from my mother, bracing myself for whatever version of anger she had crafted overnight. But the moment I pressed the phone to my ear, her voice erupted like a storm breaking open mid-sentence. "Hannah, what have you done?" Her tone sharp and panicked, thick with the kind of outrage that only appears when something that has always been taken for granted is suddenly gone. Before I could respond, she continued her words, tumbling over each other in a frantic rush. "The bank called this morning. They froze the mortgage account. They said you filed for cosigner removal. What is wrong with you? Do you understand what you have put us through?" I held the phone away from my ear slightly as she went on, the desperation in her tone growing deeper with each breath because this was no longer about humiliation. This was fear. Real fear, the kind that comes when the person you rely on to keep your life afloat suddenly stops cooperating. She demanded explanations, demanded that I fix everything immediately, demanded that I remember where I came from and when. I finally spoke. My voice came out steady, surprisingly calm, in contrast to her spiraling panic. "I told you last night I was removing myself from the loans. I am not backing out." My mother let out an incredulous laugh, the kind that sounded more like disbelief than amusement. "Hannah, do not play this game. You cannot just walk away from family. Your brother needs that truck to get to work. Your father cannot handle the mortgage on his own. We raised you, we sacrificed for you, and this is how you repay us." I closed my eyes, letting her words wash over me without sinking in, feeling only the familiar mix of guilt. They were designed to conjure guilt I finally recognized as manipulation, and I said quietly but firmly, "I cannot keep paying for decisions that were never mine. I am done." There was a long pause on the other end, the kind that feels like the air between two people has thickened with disbelief, and then my father's voice cut in, having taken the phone from my mother, deeper, angrier, steadier. "You are being dramatic, Hannah. You always take things too far. You know. Your brother needs help, we all do, and you are the only one capable of giving it." Something inside me twisted not with doubt but with recognition because his words were a perfect echo of everything I had heard my entire life, that my role was to absorb, to provide, to protect, to endure, and that Ethan's role was simply to exist while everyone else cleared the path for him. I opened my eyes and let out a breath I had been holding for years. A breath that carried with it every memory of being overlooked, undervalued, and blamed. And I said, "Dad, I am not responsible for the choices you made or the mess Ethan created. I am living my own life now, and I am not going to let you pull me back into something that has already burned me." The silence that followed was heavy, sharp, dangerous. And then my father spoke again, his voice low with warning. "You are ruining this family. Hannah, do you understand that without you, everything falls apart?" I felt the truth of that statement hit me with stunning clarity, not because he was right, but because he believed, it truly believed that the structure of our family depended on my compliance, my silence, my willingness to be used, and the realization did not hurt the way it once might have. Instead, it steeled something in me, anchoring me more firmly to the decision I had made. I told him I was hanging up, and before he could protest, I ended the call, my hand shaking only slightly as I lowered the phone onto my lap. It vibrated again, almost instantly, then again, text after text appearing in rapid succession. Ethan sending furious messages about how irresponsible I was, how I had ruined his life, how he needed his truck for work. My mother sending long paragraphs blaming me for their financial panic, calling me selfish, ungrateful, cruel, and each message felt like a desperate attempt to claw back control over someone they had assumed would always bend. I turned the phone face down, breathing slowly, and for the first time, their desperation did not pull me back in. It pushed me further away, making the space between us feel not like abandonment, but like relief, like oxygen filling a room that had been closed off for years. I walked to the window, lifting the blinds slightly to look out at the wet morning, the city moving steadily below me, indifferent to the chaos inside my phone, and I realized that for the first time in my life, the consequences of protecting myself no longer terrified me. Their panic only confirmed what I had already known, that my worth to them had always been measured in what I could provide, not in who I was. And now that I had taken away the support they felt entitled to, they were forced to confront the truth they had avoided for years, that without me, their structure cracked, their comfort trembled, their dependency stood naked and exposed. And as I watched raindrops slide down the glass like thin, silver threads, I whispered to myself, they are only falling apart because they finally cannot use me anymore. And the words felt not like cruelty, but like honesty, a truth I had earned the right to speak. Behind me, the phone buzzed again, vibrating across the wooden table. But I did not reach for it because for the first time in my life I understood that their panic did not belong to me anymore. That afternoon, long after I had silenced the last wave of frantic calls and turned my phone face down on the kitchen table, believing that maybe the chaos had burned itself out for the day, I stood at the stove, stirring a pot of pasta, the steam rising into the quiet apartment like a soft reminder that life could be simple if I let it, and I tried to focus on the rhythm of breathing in and out instead of the storm I knew was still raging hundreds of miles away in Idaho. The rain outside had slowed to a drizzle, tapping intermittently against the window, and for the first time in days, the silence felt warm rather than oppressive. But just as I reached to turn off the stove, a heavy, violent pounding rattled my front door so hard it made the picture frame on the adjoining wall tremble. The noise jarring enough that I jumped my hand, striking the edge of the counter, sending pain up my wrist. My heart lurched into my throat, beating so fiercely I could feel each throb against my ribs, and I froze the wooden spoon still in my hand, listening as the pounding came again, louder, angrier, followed by muffled voices rising in the hallway, voices I recognized instantly, even though I had not heard them in person for months. My mother's voice, shrill and panicked, shaking with a fury that barely masked desperation, and Ethan's deeper voice, loud and unhinged, echoing down the narrow stairwell as if he owned the building. For a second, I thought I might be imagining it, that stress had conjured the sound out of thin air. But then it came again. My name screamed through the metal door with a pitch that made my skin prickle. Hannah opened this door right now, and the unmistakable thud of someone's fist hitting the wood so hard the frame groaned under the impact. I backed away slowly, the spoon slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor, and every instinct inside me screamed to run, to hide, to disappear. But there was nowhere to go, nowhere to lock myself that they could not reach in seconds, and all I could do was stand there with my breath trapped in my chest while the nightmare I thought I had put distance between finally caught up with me. More pounding shook the door, and then Ethan's voice erupted raw and frantic with anger. "You ruined everything, Hannah. Everything. Do you hear me? My truck is being repossessed. My accounts are frozen. You did this. You and Mom is losing her mind because of you. You think you can just cut us out just like that?" I stumbled backward until my spine hit the wall, the cold surface sending a shock of reality through me, and with shaking hands, I grabbed my phone from the table, flipping it over to see a barrage of unread messages still multiplying, but I forced myself to ignore them and instead opened the apartment's security camera app. My fingers trembling so violently, I almost dropped the phone. The screen loaded to show the hallway outside my door, and the sight that met me made my blood run cold. My mother was standing directly in front of the door, her face red and frantic, her hair disheveled as if she had been pulling at it, her eyes wild with a mix of fear and rage, while Ethan paced behind her like a caged animal running his hands through his hair, shouting at no one and everyone all at once. And the moment he moved into full view, the hallway lights casting harsh shadows on his face, the fury in his eyes made every muscle in my body tighten with instinctive fear. I stepped away from the door, clutching my phone tightly, and dialed 911. My voice barely above a whisper as I forced myself to speak clearly into the line. "Hi, I need police assistance. 2 individuals are outside my apartment door, yelling and refusing to leave, and though the dispatcher asked for details, my voice felt like it belonged to someone else, calm in a way that did not match the chaos on the other side of the door. While I stayed on the line, my mother's voice rose again, filled with a hysterical edge that made it clear she had not come to talk, but to break me back into submission. "Hannah, open this door. You are our daughter. You do not get to walk away from us. You cannot treat us like strangers. Do you hear me open it right now?" But her words were laced with entitlement, not love. Each sentence sharpened by the belief that she still had ownership over me. Ethan slammed his fist into the door again, the noise so loud it echoed through the walls, and he shouted, "You are destroying this family, Hannah. Do you have any idea what you have done? You owe us. You owe all of us." And the way he said "oh" made the air colder, as if the truth of it had always been simmering beneath the surface. And now he no longer felt the need to hide it. The dispatcher asked if I knew the people outside my apartment, and the words felt heavy in my mouth as I said, "Yes, they are my family. But today, they are just people who refuse to respect a boundary," and saying it out loud hit me with a jolt of clarity that felt both painful and freeing. Minutes later, the camera showed movement at the end of the hallway. Two uniformed officers climbing the stairs, one man and one woman, their faces calm. Professional, steady in the way only people trained to walk into chaos could be. The dispatcher told me the officers were arriving, and I thanked her before hanging up, moving back against the far wall as the officers approached my door. My mother noticed them first, her expression morphing instantly from fury to frantic indignation as she marched toward them, hands waving wildly as she began spewing accusations. "She will not open the door. She is ruining our lives. She cut all financial support without warning. Do you understand what she is doing to us?" And she pointed at my door as if presenting evidence in a trial. The male officer raised a hand gently to stop her rambling, his voice firm but calm. "Ma'am, this is private property. If she asked you to leave, you cannot be here." And instantly, Ethan intervened, stepping between my mother and the officers, his voice breaking with anger. "I am her brother. She cannot call the cops on us. We came here because she is destroying everything. You do not understand. She owes us money. She owes us stability, and we are not leaving until she fixes this." The female officer's expression remained steady, but her jaw tightened slightly and she nodded once before speaking in a tone that brooked no argument. "It does not matter who you are if she does not want you here. You need to leave right now, or this becomes a trespassing issue." My mother's face twisted with shock, truly shocked, as if the idea that the law applied to her had never once crossed her mind, and she sputtered, "But she is my daughter. I have a right to see her." But the officer shook his head and responded, "Being her mother does not give you the right to force yourself into her home." Through the camera, I saw Ethan clench his fists, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he glared at the officers, his voice cracking with frustration as he said, "You do not get it. She pulled her name from everything. She ruined our credit. My truck might get repossessed. We need her to come out here right now." And the male officer took a single step closer, keeping his voice deliberately calm. "Sir, financial disputes do not give you the right to harass someone at their residence. If she requested space, you must respect it." I finally pressed the button on the intercom speaker beside my door, my voice coming through the hallway. Speaker steady but quiet as I said, "Officers, I did ask them to leave, and they refused, and I would like them removed." The female officer looked toward the speaker, her expression softening just slightly, a silent acknowledgement of the fear I had been carrying. And she turned back to my family with a clipped finality as she said, "You heard her. This conversation is over. You need to leave now, and if you return after this warning, you will be detained." I watched through the camera as my mother's face contorted into something between rage and disbelief, a trembling fury overtaking her features as she pointed toward my door one last time and screamed, "You will regret this! Hannah Blood does not disappear just because you say it does." But the officers had already begun guiding her toward the stairs, their presence firm enough to force movement even through her resistance. Ethan lingered for a moment, staring at my door with an expression I could not fully place. Anger, betrayal, desperation. Something wild and unhinged simmering behind his eyes, but when the officer stepped pointedly between him and the door, he finally backed away, muttering curses under his breath as he followed my mother down the stairs. Their footsteps echoed through the hallway, fading slowly until only silence remained, broken only by the soft hum of the building's heating system and my own shaky exhale, as I pressed my back against the wall, sliding down until I was sitting on the floor, my knees pulled to my chest, my hands trembling with shock and release. I stayed like that for a long moment, letting the silence wash over me, and for the first time since childhood, I felt fully protected not by family, not by love, but by the boundaries I had finally learned to enforce, boundaries that had taken a lifetime of pain to build. And as the last echo of their voices disappeared into the stairwell, the relief hit me so suddenly and so deeply that I closed my eyes and whispered into the quiet room, "It is over, at least for today," and the words felt like the beginning of something new, something mine. The next morning, I woke to a different kind of storm, not pounding fists against my apartment door, not frantic screaming in the hallway, but the quiet, insidious violence of misinformation spreading like wildfire through the screens of people who had not thought about me in years. People who never called, never checked in, never cared, until there was something dramatic enough to gossip about. It began when my coworker Jenna slid into my office at mid-morning holding her phone with a hesitant look on her face. The kind of look people wear when they are not sure whether to warn you or apologize in advance, and she set the phone gently on my desk, tapping the screen once before stepping back as if giving me space to process whatever was coming. On the screen was a Facebook post from my mother posted publicly, not limited to family, not even limited to friends, but blasted out to the entire world as if she were issuing a press release. Her profile picture, a smiling portrait taken at some church event in Idaho. Her caption written in big dramatic sentences that made my stomach twist, the opening line reading, "Sometimes the child you trust the most betrays you, the worst." And beneath that, 2 full paragraphs accusing me of stealing money, abandoning family responsibilities, and destroying their credit out of pure spite. She wrote that I had turned my back on the people who raised me, that I had financially crippled them for no reason, that I had used their trust to lift myself up while pushing them down. And each sentence was crafted to make her sound like a wounded mother, rather than a woman who had shown up at her daughter's apartment screaming like a stranger. The worst part was the final line, the one that made my hands go cold around the phone, which read, "I guess some people forget the sacrifices their parents made the moment they get a taste of Seattle life." And underneath that sentence were dozens of comments. Old neighbors from my childhood, people from church, distant relatives. I barely remembered each chiming in with judgment so casual it felt rehearsed, saying things like, "Poor Linda after everything she has done," or "Kids these days have no loyalty," or "I always knew Hannah was dramatic." I scrolled down further, each comment carving a deeper ache in my chest, not because the accusations were true, but because the people repeating them felt so comfortable condemning someone they had never taken the time to understand. And then one specific comment stopped me completely. A woman I vaguely remembered from my childhood, a neighbor who used to babysit Ethan and me, occasionally writing, "I heard she even used her parents' money to buy that apartment in Seattle, unbelievable," which was a complete lie, an accusation so disconnected from reality that I nearly laughed, except it was not funny at all. It was venom disguised as concern, and it was being shared as fact to an audience eager to believe the worst about me. My throat tightened as I set Jenna's phone back on the desk, my heart beating unevenly, my breath shaky. And for a moment, a brief, fragile moment, I felt the old instinct surge inside me. The instinct to defend myself, to write long explanations, to call my mother, and beg her to stop, to correct every lie, to take responsibility for emotions that were never mine to carry. But something inside me stopped those impulses cold. The image of my mother pounding on my apartment door just hours earlier, screaming that I owed them, that I had destroyed the family by refusing to be their lifeline, flashed through my mind, and suddenly the Facebook post felt less like an attack on my character and more like a desperate attempt to regain control of a narrative they had lost. I felt a shaky breath leave my chest as the realization settled in that this was not about truth. This was about punishment and perception, about painting me as the villain, so they would not have to face what they had done, so they could continue pretending that every boundary I enforced was an act of cruelty rather than survival. Jenna watched me waiting for me to respond, and I forced a small smile, soft but steady, as I handed her the phone and said quietly, "Thank you for showing me I appreciate it." She hesitated before asking gently if I was okay, and I nodded. Not because it was entirely true, but because it was becoming true, inch by inch, breath by breath, the more I let go of the need to change the minds of people who never cared to know the truth. When Jenna left the office, I opened my laptop and crafted a short email to my team. Not defensive, not emotional, just calm and professional writing that if anyone saw rumors circulating about me, they should ignore them. That some people respond to boundaries with anger, and that I was fine, grateful for their privacy and professionalism. And hitting send gave me a sense of relief so profound it lingered in my chest like warmth. I did not check Facebook again that day or the next because I understood now that the truth did not require my constant defense. It simply required time, and for the first time in years, I felt the strength that comes from refusing to chase the approval of those who never saw my worth. By the time I left the office that evening, the Seattle sky was a soft silver blue, the air cool against my face as I walked to my car. And even though the lies were still circulating online, they no longer felt like chains around my throat. They felt like noise from a life I had finally stepped out of. And for the first time, the silence inside me felt stronger than their voices outside. 2 days after my mother's Facebook post detonated across Idaho like a small-town scandal bomb, I was back at my desk sipping lukewarm coffee and trying to focus on a stack of student reading assessments when my phone buzzed with a notification from an app I rarely used anymore, a tag in the comments of my mother's post. And normally, I would have ignored it, but something nudged me to open it. Maybe instinct, maybe curiosity, maybe exhaustion. And when the screen loaded, the twist waiting for me was something I never saw coming, buried under more than 100 comments of judgment. Pity and thinly veiled contempt was a new comment from a familiar name, one that made my breath pause mid-inhale down Mrs. Evelyn Bradley, my 11th grade English teacher. The woman who had once handed me a worn copy of The Great Gatsby and told me I had a writer's brain, even when no one at home thought I had much of anything. Her profile picture showed her now, at least in her 60s, hair, silvering glasses perched on her nose, still radiating the same quiet intensity she had carried in the classroom, and her comment was long enough that Facebook had collapsed it with a Seymour button. My thumb hovered for a moment before I pressed it, and as the full comment expanded, a slow, almost stunned warmth spread through my chest. She had written, "I normally stay out of family matters, but I cannot stay silent here." I taught Hannah for 2 years at Caldwell High, and she was one of the hardest working students I ever met. She balanced 2 jobs, her schoolwork, and still came to class, prepared. She did not have privileges handed to her. She earned everything she has. Each sentence was precise, deliberate, unmistakably hers, but then the tone shifted slightly sharpening as if she were turning her gaze directly toward my mother, and she continued, "Linda, I remember the meetings where you showed up late or not at all. I remember Hannah trying to hide how exhausted she was, trying to explain why she had to miss school to work extra shifts. She never once asked for pity or excuses. She showed more responsibility at 15 than most adults twice her age, including some in this comment section, and my jaw tightened as I read it, because she was not just defending me, she was calling out the truth. I had spent years being gaslit out of believing. She ended with shame on anyone who tries to paint her as ungrateful or selfish. She owes you nothing but the life she is building for herself, and you should be proud instead of tearing her down. Within minutes, replies flooded beneath her comment. Some defensive, some stunned, some suddenly unsure of the narrative they had been so eager to believe. Neighbors posting variations of, "Wow, I did not know that," or "Maybe we judged too quickly," or "I always wondered why Hannah was never at family events." And for the first time since all this began, the tide was shifting. Not because I argued, not because I defended myself, but because someone who had seen the truth years before finally spoke it out loud where others could not ignore it. I stared at the screen, feeling something deep inside me loosen a knot that had been tangled since adolescence, slowly unspooling as the comments continued, the narrative shifting from condemnation to confusion, to quiet recognition that perhaps my mother's version did not line up with reality. I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of it settle the surprising lightness of being defended without having to beg for it. And then, my coworker Marcus knocked lightly on my door, sticking his head inside with a curious expression as he asked, "Are you seeing what your old teacher wrote?" Because it is kind of going viral, and I nodded, unable to stop the small stunned smile pulling at my mouth, and he grinned back before adding, I do not know everything going on, but it is good to see people stepping up for you. It means something. After he left, I looked back at the comment thread and noticed something else. Something even more unexpected. My mother had stopped replying. The long, defensive chain of comments she had been posting relentlessly had gone silent after Mrs. Bradley's message appeared, and an hour later, her entire post vanished, deleted without explanation, wiped clean as if she hoped removing it would erase the consequences. But of course the screenshots remained, and more importantly, so did the feeling. It gave me the feeling of being seen by someone who had no obligation to see me. Someone who had witnessed the truth long before anyone else had the courage to admit it. I closed the app, exhaling slowly, and let the warmth of Mrs. Bradley's words settle like sunlight across parts of me I had kept in shadows for far too long, realizing with a quiet, steady certainty that reputation built on lies crumbles easily, but truth spoken with integrity has a way of echoing, reaching people who need to hear it. And in that moment, her voice felt like the first real echo in years. 3 weeks later, on a gray Thursday morning when Seattle felt wrapped in a soft blanket of mist and the sky hung low like it was thinking through something heavy, I returned home from work carrying a grocery bag of simple things: pasta, spinach, yogurt, the kinds of items that had become a quiet ritual of stability and healing. And as I walked up the stairs to my apartment, I noticed a thick envelope wedged tightly into my mailbox slot, its corner slightly bent from someone pushing it in too forcefully. My heart gave a small, startled jolt when I saw the return address stamped neatly in dark ink across the top: Green First Bank Compliance and Lending Division. And for a moment, I simply held it, my breath suspended in my chest, because I knew instinctively that this envelope held the answer to weeks of tension, fear, and waiting. The official verdict on whether or not I had finally been released from the financial chains my family had wrapped around me for years. I carried the envelope inside, setting the grocery bag on the counter without even looking at it, and stood in the middle of my small kitchen, holding the letter like it was a live wire, my hands trembling slightly as I slid a finger under the sealed flap and tore it open slowly, carefully, as though ripping too hard might somehow alter the contents. A soft rustle filled the room as I unfolded the documents inside 3 sheets of crisp white paper thick enough to feel intentional, official. And when I read the first line, my knees weakened under me enough that I reached out and steadied myself against the counter, my eyes stinging with a pressure that was not quite tears but something close, something warm and overwhelming. The letter read, "This document confirms that Miss Hannah Walker has been fully released from all liabilities and financial obligations associated with the joint mortgage loan under the names of Richard and Diane Walker." And my breath hitched in my throat, coming out in a small, uneven exhale that shook through my entire body. The next page contained the second confirmation, equally decisive and resolute. This document confirms that Miss Hannah Walker has been removed as co-borrower and co-liable party on the vehicle loan registered under Ethan Walker. And I felt a quiet gasp escape me, barely audible, but powerful enough that I had to sit, lowering myself slowly into one of the chairs at my tiny dining table, as if gravity had suddenly doubled. I read the line again and again, letting the truth of it sink into the parts of me that had been coiled in tension for years, parts that had always braced for the worst. And beneath those confirmations was a third document, the resolution from the credit fraud investigation into the store credit card opened under my Social Security number, stating clearly, "The account has been closed and removed from Miss Walker's credit report following verification of unauthorized activity." The words blurred slightly as I stared at them, my eyes burning now, the emotion rising fast and sharp. Not the raw pain that had haunted me for so long, but something gentler, something that felt closer to liberation than anything I had ever known. I pressed the papers flat on the table, smoothing out the creases with trembling fingertips, and for several long seconds I just sat there, absorbing the reality that the system had finally recognized officially and unquestionably what I had known all along. I had been exploited, used, manipulated, and burdened with responsibilities that were never mine to carry. And now, with each carefully typed line, the weight had been lifted. I leaned back in the chair, letting my head fall slightly against the wall, closing my eyes as a single relieved breath pushed from deep inside me. A breath that felt like it had been trapped in my lungs since childhood. I thought about the moment I first learned my college fund had been drained for Ethan, the day I discovered they had opened credit in my name every time they'd called me ungrateful for saying no. Every guilt-laden comment, every emotional lash disguised as family duty, every time they told me I was dramatic when they were the ones pulling the strings tied around my throat. All of it had led to this moment, this official recognition that I was no longer responsible for their chaos, no longer tied to their debt, no longer obligated to fix their disasters. I stood slowly holding the documents again, needing to feel their weight, their edges, the physical proof that I had not imagined any of this, that freedom was real, tangible. Printed in black ink on white paper, and I walked to the window, lifting the blinds slightly to look out at the city below where headlights moved like soft streams of light along the wet pavement, and the sight grounded me, reminded me that life continued, that healing happened in the smallest, quietest increments. I laid the papers carefully on the table and reached for my phone, opening it not to message my family or confront them, but simply to text one person, Mr. Benjamin Clark, the credit specialist who had guided me through the maze of paperwork with a steady kindness I had not expected from a stranger, writing simply, "The documents arrived today, and I wanted to thank you for helping me take control of my life again." And within minutes, he replied, "You did all the hard work, Hannah. I'm just glad you finally got the justice you deserved." I smiled faintly at the word justice, a word that had always felt too big, too dramatic, too cinematic for my life. Yet here it was, sitting comfortably in my reality, reshaping the way I understood my own strength. I set my phone down and picked up the papers once more, running my thumb over the embossed gold seal at the bottom of the first page. The green First Bank emblem pressed into the paper with a formality that made everything feel even more real, more definitive. And I imagined my mother, my father, Ethan, receiving their own notifications from the bank, learning that the leverage they once held over me had disappeared, evaporated into nothing the moment my name had been officially removed. I could picture the panic, the realization, the unraveling that must have followed not out of cruelty, but out of a deep, honest understanding of how much they had relied on my silence, on my compliance, on my willingness to be the one who always stepped in, always helped, always carried more than she could bear. The irony was sharp and almost poetic that the very thing they had counted on me for had been the weapon they used to keep me small, and now that weapon had dissolved. I walked back to the kitchen counter and poured myself a glass of water, holding it with both hands as I took a slow sip, feeling the coolness settle inside me, like a reminder that life was allowed to feel calm, allowed to feel manageable, allowed to feel like mine. I turned and looked again at the documents on the table, the words shimmering slightly under the overhead light, and whispered softly to the empty room, "It's finally over." And even though no one else could hear it, the walls seemed to hold the truth of those words, gently, securely, like an echo that would never fade. I sat down again, placing my hand over the documents, grounding myself in the moment, feeling the full weight of what it meant to be finally completely free, and for the first time in my life, I let myself believe that I deserved this freedom, not because I had earned it through suffering, but because I had chosen it through courage, and that choice had rewritten everything. In the days that followed the arrival of the liability release documents, a quiet yet undeniable shift rippled through my life like the first tremor before a long-awaited earthquake. And although I did not speak to my family, their unraveling reached me anyway through voicemails, text messages, and the occasional screenshot from someone back in Idaho who thought I should know that the people who once stood over me with so much confidence were now crumbling under the weight of the consequences they had built for themselves. The first sign came 3 days after the letter arrived, a voicemail from Ethan. His voice hoarse and panicked in a way I had never heard before, a sharp contrast to the booming entitlement he had hurled at my apartment door during his outburst, and in the message he said, barely keeping his breath steady, "Hannah, they took my truck this morning. A tow company came at 6. I tried to stop them, but they said the bank ordered it. They dragged it off the driveway. And my manager said, I cannot come back to work until I have transportation. This is your fault. You know that you did this. You ruined my life. And hearing those words should have sent a spike of guilt through me. But instead, it felt like a bitter reminder of how deeply he believed I existed only to hold him together. I deleted the voicemail without responding, choosing not to feed the narrative that I owed him anything, and a strange calm washed over me as I realized that his downfall was not a result of my cruelty, but of his own long-standing choices finally meeting reality without my support as a buffer. The next unraveling came from my mother, whose Facebook presence had turned from righteous fury to frantic excuses with posts that lurked in a strange space between denial and desperation. Messages like, "Please pray for our family during this difficult time," and some people forget loyalty, but God sees everything. But people were no longer responding with sympathy, instead offering cautious comments, small questions, subtle skepticism, as if misses. Bradley's public defense of me had planted seeds of doubt in a community that once unquestioningly sided with my mother, and the shift seemed to frustrate her deeply, because I began receiving long emotional texts from her written late-at-night messages that swung wildly between blame and pleading, one saying, "You have no idea the pain you caused. We cannot get approved for anything. Now our credit score is in shambles. Your father and I are arguing every day because of your selfish choices," and another sent hours later saying, "We were just trying to help Ethan until he got on his feet. Why would you turn your back on family? Do you really hate us that much?" Followed again by a third message that simply read, "Your grandmother would be disappointed in you." I stared at those messages each time they arrived, feeling a swirl of detached sadness and steady resolve, because they no longer broke me the way they once would have. Instead, they reinforced the truth I had fought so hard to claim, that my boundaries were not cruelty, they were survival. Through another mutual contact, I learned that my father had been forced to pick up extra shifts at the warehouse because the mortgage was now entirely on him. And one evening, while scrolling through my phone before bed, I received a screenshot of my parents standing outside a credit union, my mother with her arms crossed tightly, her face twisted with frustration, my father looking tired, worn, beaten down in a way I had never seen before, and according to the message attached, they had been denied for a refinancing request due to their damaged credit profile. A profile that had once been artificially upheld because my income and credit worthiness were tied to it. For years, they had used my stability as a foundation while simultaneously belittling me for not doing enough, and now that foundation was gone, leaving only the cracks they had ignored for so long. I did not rejoice at their misfortune, but neither did I feel responsible for softening it, and that neutrality, that emotional distance, felt like a victory in itself. As for Ethan, things deteriorated quickly, and within a week, I received a message from an old high school acquaintance who still lived near my parents, saying that Ethan had missed 3 days of work because he had no transportation and his supervisor had let him go, explaining that constant lateness and reliance on others had made him a liability long before the truck repossession, but the loss of his vehicle merely exposed the problem. He apparently exploded at my parents, shouting loud enough for neighbors to hear, accusing them of not fixing things fast enough, not helping him, not forcing me to undo what I had done, and for the first time in his privileged life, he could not blame anyone but himself, though he still tried to pin the consequences on me. One night, around 10:45, my phone lit up with a call from my father, and though I did not answer, I listened to the voicemail afterward, his voice quieter than usual, worn down, and he said, "Hannah, things are bad here, worse than you think. Your brother is a mess. Your mother is taking it out on everyone, and I cannot fix this on my own. Please, just talk to us." And when his voice cracked at the end, I felt a brief flicker of something soft, old familiar, but it faded quickly because I knew that even in his desperation, he was still asking me to hold up the structure that had collapsed because they built it on my back, never theirs. In the following days, the silence from Idaho grew heavier, but not in the way it once had frightened me. It felt like a vacuum created by the implosion of their expectations because they had genuinely believed I would cave, that I would come running the moment things got hard. That guilt would pull me back into their orbit, and when I did not, when I remained steady in my boundaries, they were forced to face their own instability without me as the scapegoat or safety net. The irony was not lost on me that the moment they finally felt the consequences of years of manipulation was the moment I freed myself, and as their world fell apart piece by piece, mine grew steadier, clearer, more grounded. I cooked dinner one evening, pasta simmering on the stove, wine breathing in a glass beside me, and as I listened to soft music drifting through my apartment, I realized that peace does not come when the people who hurt you apologize. It comes when you stop needing their chaos to define your importance. A week later, I received one final message from an unknown Idaho number, a simple text that read, "They are all blaming each other. Now your mom says it is Ethan's fault. Ethan says it is your dad's fault. Your dad says he cannot live like this anymore." And I stared at the message, absorbing the truth that they were now turning inward, fighting among themselves because they no longer had me to absorb the blame. And that twist, that final unraveling, felt like poetic justice. Not revenge, but balance, a reordering of a system that had long been built on my silence. Something in me softened with that realization. A quiet acceptance that justice does not always come with courtroom speeches or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it comes quietly in the form of people finally experiencing the consequences they tried to dump onto someone else. And as I stood by my window that night watching the soft glow of the Seattle skyline stretch across the horizon, I whispered into the glass, not out of cruelty, but clarity. They are finally carrying their own weight. The shift into healing did not happen with a single moment of clarity or a dramatic sunrise or some sudden epiphany that erased years of hurt. It happened slowly, quietly, like the gentlest tide, reshaping a shoreline. Grain by grain, so subtly that I didn't even realize it was happening. Until one morning I stepped out of my apartment and the air felt different, lighter, as if the weight I had carried for so long had finally loosened its grip on my chest. After the chaos collapsed behind me and the noise from Idaho dwindled into occasional bitter echoes, life in Seattle began to soften in ways I didn't expect. Small ways that carried a kind of peace I'd never experienced before, like waking up without bracing for a crisis, like drinking my morning coffee without my phone buzzing with demands, like walking into my new job at the elementary school and knowing that the only thing anyone expected of me was to show up, be present, and do my best. I moved from my modest Queen Anne apartment to a brighter place in Capitol Hill, a one-bedroom with tall windows that let in the morning light and overlooked a tree-lined street where people walked their dogs and chatted with neighbors. A kind of everyday normalcy that felt almost luxurious after spending years feeling like my life was on fire. Unpacking became its own kind of ceremony, gently placing books I loved onto new shelves, hanging soft curtains, arranging a little plant I bought from Pike Place Market on the window ledge. And with each small act, I felt like I was laying the bricks of a life built entirely on my own choices, my own voice, my own belonging. The first time I walked into my new classroom, sunlight pouring through the wide windows onto tiny desks decorated with stickers and crayon drawings, a strange swell of emotion filled my chest, as if the room itself was reminding me that there were still places in the world where kindness and structure existed, where chaos didn't define relationships, where a raised voice meant excitement, not danger. The children came in with their backpacks bouncing behind them, eyes bright with curiosity, some shy, some energetic, and they looked at me with a trust so unfiltered it nearly unraveled me, because it made me realize how foreign unconditional acceptance had become. In the staff lounge, coworkers welcomed me with warm smiles, offering coffee, sharing stories about their pets, their kids, their weekend plans. And I found myself learning how to exist in a world where connection wasn't a transaction, where affection didn't have strings attached, where my value wasn't measured by how much I could give up. In the evenings, my apartment transformed into a sanctuary. Soft lamps turning the space amber, music playing quietly from the kitchen as I cooked simple meals, letting the rhythm of a chopping vegetables or stirring soup soothe me in a way I had never allowed before, because for the first time in my life, home actually felt like home, not a place where I needed to tiptoe, not a place where I needed to earn my place, not a place where someone waited to shame me for taking up space. My friends became another anchor in this new version of my life. Especially Elena, who showed up one Saturday morning with a bouquet of wildflowers, placing them in my hands, with a small smile as she said, "Families aren't just the ones we're born into. Sometimes they're the ones who walk beside us when everyone else walks away." And I realized that healing sometimes looks like people who choose you without reason other than they want to. Marcus visited one evening with a bag of takeout Thai food, teasing me about my cactus sitting on the windowsill, telling me it looked so serious it could pass as a tiny security guard. And I laughed. Really laughed. Something deep and unguarded that made my shoulders relax and my breath feel easy, reminding me that joy didn't always need to be earned. Sometimes it could just exist. Therapy became another quiet part of my healing, not dramatic or cathartic in the way movies portray it, but steady grounding, like building a bridge toward a version of myself I had never been introduced to properly learning how to recognize my own boundaries, how to name hurt without letting it define me, how to understand that choosing myself wasn't betrayal. It was survival. Some mornings I would wake before my alarm drawn to the windows, where gray Seattle light filtered into the room in soft layers, and I would stand there with my hands resting lightly on the glass, looking out at the quiet street below, feeling a tenderness settle in my chest as I acknowledged something I had never let myself feel fully: safety. I began taking weekend walks around Volunteer Park, watching the ducks in the pond, sitting on benches beneath old trees whose branches seemed to hold stories older than any pain I carried, and I realized that healing wasn't about forgetting what happened. It was about creating enough peace inside myself that the past no longer dictated the present. One day, while sorting through a stack of mail, I found a letter from Mrs. Bradley written in her familiar, neat cursive, telling me she was proud of me for standing up for myself, that she hoped my new life brought me all the gentleness I had been denied, and her words filled me with a warmth that wrapped around the most bruised parts of me, reminding me that not all adults abandoned their responsibilities. Some stepped in even years later to remind you that you mattered. On Friday afternoons, after the final bell rang and the children ran out into the afternoon sun, I would sit at my desk, the room quiet now except for the distant laughter echoing down the hallway, and I would feel a profound sense of gratitude that I had created a life where happiness didn't depend on appeasing people who never appreciated me. A life where peace wasn't something I had to chase. A life where love wasn't something I had to earn. Healing wasn't linear. I had bad days, moments where a random smell or sound triggered a memory I didn't want, moments where my chest tightened with the old fear that I might be punished for simply existing, moments where I wondered if I had been too harsh, too distant, too decisive. But each time those thoughts surfaced, I reminded myself of the nights I cried alone, of the years I spent breaking myself to keep others comfortable, of the humiliation I endured, while no one stepped in to help. And I breathed slowly until the truth returned: choosing myself was never wrong. One evening, as I sat on my small balcony with a cup of chamomile tea warming my hands, watching the city lights shimmer like scattered stars across the skyline, I whispered softly to the night air, "I'm okay." And for the first time in my entire life, I believed it without hesitation. It wasn't a declaration or a victory cry. It was a gentle truth settling into place, an acknowledgement that healing had taken root, steady and sure, blooming quietly inside the spaces where pain once lived. And that quiet blooming felt like the beginning of a future I finally deserved. Almost a full year after the day my family's world collapsed in on itself and mine finally opened, the apology arrived, not with the thunderous drama I once imagined. Not with tears or pleas or grand gestures, but quietly, unexpectedly, on a soft Sunday morning when sunlight stretched gently across my apartment floor and the scent of freshly brewed coffee drifted through the air as I stood barefoot in the kitchen, slicing fruit for breakfast. My phone buzzed on the counter, a simple vibration so ordinary I barely glanced at it, assuming it was a coupon offer or a school reminder. But when I picked it up and saw the name on the screen, Ethan Walker, my breath caught mid-swallow and the knife paused in my hand, suspended above the cutting board as the weight of 1,000 memories pressed lightly against my ribs. For a long moment, I simply stared at the name, feeling a strange mixture of curiosity, caution, and something softer I couldn't quite name. And finally, with a slow inhale, I opened the message. It contained only 6 words, no introduction, no excuses, no careful framing meant to make himself look better, just a single sentence that read, "Hannah, I'm sorry for everything," and somehow those 6 words landed more heavily than any long apology ever could have not. Because they fixed anything or stitched old wounds together, but because they carried none of the entitlement or anger or desperation I had come to expect from him. They were simple, stripped down, unadorned, almost fragile, as if written by someone who had finally run out of places to hide from the truth. I read the message twice, then a third time, letting it sink into parts of me I had long protected, remembering the boy he had been, the brother who once shared comic books with me under our blankets when we were kids, the teenager who became the golden child without ever earning the title, the man who shoved my graduation cake to the ground and forced my head toward it while our parents laughed. And the years of silence, cruelty, and entitlement layered between those memories felt like sediment packed tightly in the spaces between us. I set the phone down gently, almost deliberately, and leaned my hands against the counter, grounding myself in the texture of the cool surface as I breathed through the small ache rising in my chest. Not pain exactly, but the echo of everything that had been lost, everything that had been taken, everything that had shaped me into someone who finally chose herself. Part of me expected the old instinct to rise, the reflexive urge to fix, to respond quickly, to soothe his guilt, or offer reassurance. But that instinct no longer lived in me the way it once had, and the silence that followed his message felt neither heavy nor cruel. It felt clean, honest, necessary. I picked up the phone again, not to type a reply, but to read the message one last time, noticing the subtle vulnerability folded into the simplicity of his words, and I wondered what had pushed him to send them, whether it was the loss of his truck, the fracture in the family he once believed would always shelter him, the consequences he had finally been forced to face on his own, or simply the slow, inevitable unraveling of childhood illusions. But whatever the reason, it belonged to him, not to me. I walked to the window, the city bathed in morning gold beneath me, cars moving steadily along the street, people walking dogs, sipping coffee, carrying their own joys and burdens through the gentle quiet of the day, and I held the phone loosely in my hand as I whispered softly into the sunlight. I hope you find your way, not out of obligation or lingering affection, but out of a kindness I had reclaimed for myself, a kindness that no longer required self-betrayal to offer. And then, with a steady exhale, I set the phone face down on the table, letting the message rest there untouched, unreturned, a quiet boundary wrapped in acceptance. Because forgiveness did not require reopening the door, and healing did not require going backward. Sometimes the truest act of love for others and for yourself is simply letting the past remain in the past and choosing peace over participation. In the quiet months that followed Ethan's unexpected apology, I found myself reflecting not on the chaos that had once consumed me, but on the strange and gentle clarity that had settled into my life like a long-awaited exhale, the kind that only arrives when you have walked through a storm and finally stepped into a place where the air is no longer heavy. I often stood by the tall windows of my Capitol Hill apartment in the early mornings, watching the soft drizzle of Seattle rain streak down the glass in thin silver threads, and in those moments, I felt a profound stillness inside me, as if my heart had finally found room to rest after years of bracing for impact. I would lean my forehead lightly against the cool pane, letting my eyes trace the movement of people below umbrellas. Bobbing coffee cups, steaming dogs tugging their owners eagerly along the sidewalk, and I would marvel at how different my life felt now. How different I felt, not because everything was perfect or even easy, but because for the first time I was living a life shaped by my own decisions rather than by fear, obligation, or old wounds disguised as loyalty. Sometimes I thought about the version of myself who once believed she had to earn every ounce of affection, who thought boundaries were selfish, who stayed small so others could feel big, and I felt a deep tenderness for her, almost like mourning a childhood friend, because she had survived far more than anyone around her ever realized, carrying burdens she never should have been asked to carry. Other times, I thought about the people who had tried to convince me that love meant sacrifice without reciprocity, that family meant obedience rather than safety, and I no longer felt anger toward them, not even bitterness, only a quiet recognition that some people cling to dysfunction so tightly they mistake it for love, and letting them go had been the kindest thing I had done for myself. As I pieced together my life in Seattle, I realized healing had not made me harder or colder. It had made me softer in the right places and stronger in the places that had needed reinforcement, like learning how to say no without apologizing, how to accept care from others without feeling indebted, how to sit alone in my apartment on a Friday night with nothing but a mug of tea and the soft hum of the city, and feel not loneliness, but peace. In my classroom, the students seemed to sense the shift too, perhaps because children have an uncanny ability to read the emotional weather of the adults around them, and I found myself smiling more easily, laughing more openly, offering patience without resentment, and receiving their innocent affection in ways that softened parts of me I had once thought were permanently closed. One afternoon, while helping a student glue construction paper onto a poster board, a little girl looked up at me with wide brown eyes and said, "Miss Walker, you're really nice." And the simplicity of her statement nearly brought tears to my eyes, not because I doubted her words, but because for the first time I believed them without arguing. There were days when the past still brushed against me, small reminders like a voicemail from an unfamiliar Idaho number that I chose not to check, or the faint memory of the humiliation I once endured in a backyard full of people who claimed to love me. But those memories felt distant now, like pages from a book I had read long ago, still meaningful but no longer defining. The most surprising part of this new chapter was not the absence of my family, but the absence of the pain their absence once caused, because I had always believed losing them would break me. Yet instead, it had freed me, peeling away the layers of obligation and guilt, until what remained was someone I recognized not by her wounds, but by her resilience. Every so often I caught myself thinking about forgiveness, not the performative kind that demands reconciliation, but the quiet internal forgiveness that comes from releasing the grip of resentment, and I realized I had already forgiven them in a way, not because they earned it, but because I no longer needed to carry the weight of their choices on my shoulders. I had learned that forgiveness is not a door reopened, but a burden set down. On a late summer evening, as I sat on my balcony with the warm wind brushing against my skin, I whispered to myself a truth that had taken nearly 25 years to understand. Family is not defined by blood. It is defined by safety, by kindness, by the people who choose you without requiring you to shrink. I said the words softly, letting them linger in the twilight air, feeling the truth of them settle deep inside me, and for the first time, the reflection staring back from the sliding door was not someone trying to outrun her past, but someone finally fully rooted in her future. As the seasons changed and life in Seattle settled into a rhythm that felt both gentle and steady, I found myself reflecting not just on my own journey, but on the countless people silently carrying stories like mine. People who had spent years trying to prove their worth to families who measured love in terms of usefulness rather than compassion. And I realized that what I had lived through was not rare, not isolated, not unusual in the way I once believed. Many of the parents and older adults who watched my story unfold online reached out through quiet messages sharing pieces of their own heartbreak, their own regrets, their own stories of children who pulled away or parents they could never please, and I felt a deep responsibility to speak to them honestly, especially to the older audience who had grown up in a generation where family loyalty was treated not as a hope, but as a mandate, a rule, a script that left no room for individuality or boundaries. I wanted them to understand that the heart of my story was not rebellion or defiance or disrespect, but self-preservation, a basic human need to protect one's dignity, one's mental health, one's right to feel safe in their own skin, and that sometimes the people who raised you can be the very ones who strip those things away without realizing the damage they leave behind. In speaking to them, I wished I could reach through the screen, sit across from them at their kitchen tables, hands folded gently, coffee steaming between us, and say the words so many younger women have never been able to say to their elders without being dismissed. Boundaries are not betrayal. I would explain that I grew up believing love meant sacrificing myself until nothing was left, that loyalty meant silence, even when I was hurting, that being a good daughter meant fixing problems I didn't create. And that belief took root so deeply that I didn't recognize it as harm until it almost suffocated me. And I would look into their eyes and tell them that many women of my generation learned the same lesson, not because we were ungrateful, but because we were taught from childhood that our value lived in our obedience, our ability to overfunction, our willingness to absorb emotional weight until we collapsed under it. To the parents watching, especially mothers in their 50s and 60s who had been told their children drifting away was a personal failure, I wanted to say, sometimes your children set boundaries not to punish you, but to finally heal from wounds they were too young to name. Sometimes they step back, not because they don't love you, but because loving you has cost them parts of themselves they cannot afford to lose anymore. And to the older fathers whose voices carried the beliefs of their upbringing, who believed that authority equaled respect and respect equaled silence, I wanted to explain gently that fear is not the same thing as loyalty, that obedience is not the same thing as love, and that a child who pulls away is not always rejecting the parent. Sometimes they are simply reclaiming parts of themselves they were never allowed to hold. I wanted the older audience to understand that healing does not mean erasing the past or pretending that pain did not exist, but recognizing it, naming it, and choosing to break the cycle rather than repeat it. I wanted them to know that many of us grew up watching our parents sacrifice everything, and instead of learning gratitude, we learned that suffering was love, and that belief was passed down like an heirloom until we began to question it for the first time. To the mothers who wrote to me saying they hadn't talked to their daughters in years and didn't know why, I wished I could tell them to ask with softness instead of defensiveness, to listen instead of reacting, to understand that the strongest relationships between parents and adult children are built not on fear, but on respect, on acceptance, on the willingness to apologize when harm is done. I wished I could help them understand that the phrase "you owe us" is one of the fastest ways to lose a child's heart, because love that must be paid back in guilt is not love at all. To the grandmothers and older women who messaged me saying they saw their younger selves in my story, women who had sacrificed everything only to be overlooked, ignored, dismissed, I wanted to reach back through time and tell them that their worth was always inherent, that it didn't need to be earned through suffering or silence, that their resilience was not a weapon to be used against them, but a testament to who they were beneath all the expectations placed upon them. I wanted to tell them that breaking generational patterns is a courage many never find, and those who do are often misunderstood until hindsight catches up. And finally, to the older men and women who asked me what the moral of my story was, what they should hold on to after the credits fade, after the video ends, after the emotions settle, I would tell them this family is not defined by blood. It is defined by safety. It is defined by the people who show up without demanding that you shrink it, is defined by those who lift you, rather than use you, by those who listen, rather than dismiss, by those who apologize rather than blame, and by those who protect your dignity rather than strip it away. I would tell them that children do not stop loving their parents easily. It takes years of hurt, years of being unseen, years of being asked to carry burdens no child should bear, and when a child finally steps away, it is not abandonment, it is survival. And I would tell them that if they have a daughter or son who walked away, the path back will never be found through guilt or shame or demands, but through humility, through accountability, through the willingness to say the words that many parents struggle to speak. I'm sorry, I didn't know better, but I want to now. Above all, I wanted the older audience to know that love is not measured by sacrifice or silence, but by kindness, empathy, and the willingness to change. And if even one person watching my story could see that, could soften, could listen differently, then perhaps the pain I lived through would not be just pain, but the beginning of something healing, not only for me, but for them too. On a cool autumn evening in Seattle, as the last amber light of the day slipped behind the skyline and the city began to glow with the soft hum of street lamps and apartment windows flickering to life, I stood by the wide glass doors of my balcony with a cup of warm tea in my hands, letting the steam curl softly against my face. And I realized that for the first time in my life, I felt a peace so steady it almost startled me. The city below moved with its usual calm rhythm, cars gliding along damp streets, people walking briskly with jackets pulled tight against the wind, distant music floating from an open window somewhere down the block. Yet even the noise felt gentle, like background music to a life that finally made sense. I stepped onto the balcony, feeling the crisp air brush against my skin, and leaned against the railing as I looked out at the city that had become my refuge, my rebirth, my home, and in the quiet that wrapped around me. I let myself think about the long road that had led me here, not with bitterness or longing, but with the kind of reflective clarity that only comes when wounds have turned into stories rather than open pain. I thought about that backyard in Idaho, the laughter that sounded like knives, the humiliation that once felt like it would split me open. And I thought about the night I drove through the darkness toward Seattle, not knowing where I was going or who I would become, only knowing I could not stay where I was. I thought about the years of being the responsible one, the one who paid the bills, the one who carried the guilt, the one who bent and bent until there was nothing left to bend except my own spirit. And then I thought about the moment everything snapped into focus, the moment I realized that silence was not the same as peace, that loyalty without safety was not love, that being someone's daughter did not mean I had to be their sacrifice. The transformation had not been dramatic or sudden. It had been slow, painful, and at times unbearably lonely. But as I looked out at the sprawling lights of Seattle, stretching like constellations across the land, I felt gratitude for every step that had brought me to this balcony, to this apartment, to this version of myself who finally felt rooted and whole. Inside, the soft lamp beside my couch cast a warm glow across the living room, illuminating the small signs of a life I had built with care. The books stacked neatly on the coffee table, the potted plant thriving by the window, the framed photos of friends who had become like chosen family, the small knitted blanket thrown across the back of the sofa, and I felt a tenderness for the woman who had created this space, a woman who had once believed she was unworthy of gentleness. I sipped my tea slowly, letting the warmth seep into me, and allowed myself to imagine the future not with fear or uncertainty, but with quiet hope, envisioning years filled with meaningful work friendships that enriched rather than drained mornings spent walking through Capitol Hill's tree-lined streets, evenings filled with laughter instead of shouting, and a life where I could continue to grow without needing to shrink for anyone. As I stood there, a light breeze rustled the leaves of the small plant by my feet, and I thought about forgiveness, about how people assume forgiveness is a reunion, a second chance, a reopening of a wound. But for me, forgiveness had been something simpler and far more profound. It had been the moment I accepted that the people who hurt me would never give me the apology I once believed I needed, and I chose to stop holding the past hostage inside my own heart. I had forgiven them in the gentlest way possible by letting go of their power over me, by acknowledging the pain but not living inside it, by releasing them from the expectations they never met and releasing myself from the duty of fixing what was never mine to fix. I took a deep breath, the kind that fills your chest all the way to the bottom, and felt something inside me settle firmly into place, a sense of closure that didn't feel like an ending but rather like a beginning. And I whispered into the quiet air, almost as if the city itself were listening. I'm finally free. The words floated out into the twilight, soft but certain, carrying none of the desperation they once held, only truth, only gratitude, only the steady rhythm of a life that no longer hurt to inhabit. Behind me, my apartment glowed with the warm colors of a home that felt safe, the kind of safety I had spent years searching for in the wrong places. And as I walked back inside, closing the sliding door gently behind me, I felt the softness of the carpet beneath my feet and the subtle hum of the heater turning on, and I realized that healing didn't look like erasing the past. It looked like creating a present that didn't resemble it. I set my tea on the table beside the lamp and stood for a moment in the center of the room, letting my eyes move across the space, absorbing the stillness, the quiet, the warmth, and I allowed myself to smile. Not the tight, practiced smile I had worn for so many years, but a real one, soft and unforced, born from a place inside me that finally felt whole. I walked to the window and pulled the curtain halfway closed, leaving just enough space to let the city lights peek through. And as I turned off the lamp, the room settled into a comfortable half-darkness, illuminated only by the soft glow of Seattle outside, and I whispered a quiet thank you, not to anyone in particular, but to the universe, to the city, to myself, to every version of me that had survived long enough to become this one. And standing there, wrapped in the kind of peace I once believed was impossible, I understood that freedom had not been the moment I drove away, or the moment the bank released me from the loans, or the moment the police escorted my family away from my door. Freedom had been the moment I finally chose myself fully and without hesitation, and as I breathed in the cool, quiet air of the room around me, I knew that choice would guide the rest of my life.